Welcome. This is the first in a series of videos about reproduction and development. Our first video will focus on reproduction. The definition of reproduction is the ability to give rise to viable offspring by passing on genetic information. Offspring are the products of reproduction, so puppies for dogs, kittens for cats, infants for humans, and for bacteria, new cells. Viable offspring survive and reproduce on their own. A species is a group of closely related organisms that share certain characteristics. New individuals by reproduction. The reason this is important is because understanding reproduction includes the relationships among living things. Only members of a species can reproduce successfully. So these chimpanzees are all members of the same species. When they reproduce, they produce more chimpanzees. Dogs are all the same species. Even though we see different breeds of dogs, they are all the same species, which is why you can mate two dogs and get something like a labradoodle. No matter what, when they produce viable offspring. An example of where that's not true would be this. This is a mule. Now, a mule is the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Mating these two organisms produces this sterile hybrid, which we call a mule. The mule cannot produce its own offspring. It does survive, but I question, is it really worth living that life if you cannot reproduce? More on that later. Another far-fetched example, but certainly one that exists, is between big cats like the lion and the tiger. When they mate, which would never happen because lions live in Africa and tigers live in Asia, but when they have been given the ability to mate, they produce an organism such as a liger. Again, a liger is a hybrid. It is sterile. It cannot produce its own young. So, reinforcing the idea that you have to be members of the same species in order to reproduce. The ultimate goal of all living things is to stay alive long enough just to reproduce. I know that sounds far-fetched for us as human beings because that's not what drives our lives for the most part. But in the animal world, in the natural world, this is true. This is how things work. For example, animals fight for the right to mate. And then being able to reproduce is a demonstration of having superior traits. So reproducing equals success. If you reproduce and have offspring, your genes and your DNA are able to continue. Think of it like fathers who want their sons to carry out their family name, right? To reproduce and have sons means your name lives on. It's really the same thing in the natural world. It doesn't only mean that living things do this. Viruses are an example of a non-living entity that really has one sole purpose, and that purpose is to hijack a healthy cell and turn that cell into a factory to make more viral DNA. The only goal here for the virus is to make more viruses. The virus doesn't want to destroy its host, so the host cell doesn't want to destroy it. It wants to use it to make more viral DNA. So again, that same concept is reproducing equals success. The more you can reproduce, the more successful you were. Now, this is a backwards way of doing this, but since we're talking about reproduction, we probably should take a glance at what's involved, and that's DNA. So DNA you've probably heard about up until this point. You know that every living thing has it, but what you may not know is what DNA actually is. DNA contains the instructions for building cells, tissues, organs, a whole organism. These instructions are written in a code, and that code is called a gene. Now, the genes are written in nucleotide sequences, the A's, the T's, the C's, the G's. The arrangements of these nucleotides matter, and sections of DNA ultimately control physical traits. So for humans, eye color, hair color, skin color, height, other physical characteristics. These are all controlled by sections of DNA called genes. The reason why this is important to talk about DNA, to talk about genes in terms of reproduction, is that living things that survive and reproduce are passing on their genes, their DNA, in different ways. And these ways fall into two categories. You have asexual and sexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction involves one parent or one cell, and that cell divides and grows into a new cell. The offspring are genetically identical. It's like pressing on a Mac Command-C and making a copy of a file. That's basically what asexual reproduction is. You're making an exact copy. Now, there are different ways asexual reproduction happens. So the way that I just described is cell division, a cell splitting into two. But that's not the only way asexual reproduction can occur. It can also occur in multicellular organisms, like a hydra, where the offspring bud or grow out of the side of the parent organism, and it's an exact copy. The same thing can happen for a one-celled yeast. A new individual grows, a new cell grows as a bud from the parent. In plants, an example of asexual reproduction, this is multicellular versions of asexual reproduction. These plantlets are exact copies of the parent plant. And when they fall to the ground, they grow into completely healthy individuals. And the last one is a method of farming that, with certain crops that have desirable traits, we're able to graft them together and create plants that, bear multiple kinds of fruit. For example, this picture showing a lemon, oranges, and lime all in the same tree. That's really not how it works, but whoever was farming and grafted this plant wanted that to happen. And that's something that you can do with plants. No matter which example we're referring to, the offspring are always identical to one another in the end. Now, the other type of reproduction is sexual reproduction. You have two parents. The offspring are genetically different. They are not identical, so therefore the sisters and the brothers, right, have something called variation. We'll talk about this later on in a subsequent video, but it's important to point out now that sexual reproduction increases genetic variation in a population. The most important concept to remember here is that because of that variation, sexual reproduction increases the chances of offspring surviving, because in reality, they're all different, just a little different. And that little difference gives individuals an advantage. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.